Okay, thanks for joining us today. Good afternoon. I'd like to start today's webinar with an acknowledgement of country. We would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we create and share our learning resources. We acknowledge the traditional owners as the original storytellers, teachers and students of the land we call Australia. We pay our respects to elders, past and present. We also extend that respect to all Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. My name is Joanna Lake and I'm the Product Manager for Primary Licensing and Export at Oxford University Press ANZ. I'm delighted to be joined today by an expert panel to discuss our topic, Drive Reading Success with Phonics. Before I introduce our panellists, we're going to run a poll today towards the end of the session. A pop-up will appear with a question and some answer options. We'd love for you to click your response and then we'll let you know the result at the end of the session. So it'd be really great to hear your answers from your experiences in the classroom. Now I'd like to introduce our panellists. I'm joined today by Janet Fellows. Janet is an experienced literacy educator, consultant, senior lecturer in teacher training and co-author of Language, Literacy and Early Childhood Education. Grace Oakley. Grace has been a teacher educator for over 20 years with a particular interest in language and literacy in the early childhood and primary years. Grace is co-author of Language, Literacy and Early Childhood Education with Janet. Hayley Goldsworthy. Hayley has over 15 years of teaching experience and is now lead trainer at Ruth Miskin Training, supporting schools across Australia using the Read Writing program. Dr. Nathaniel Swain. Nathaniel is a teacher, instructional coach and researcher. He has worked as a lecturer and a research fellow, and in recent years, Nathaniel has been supporting schools and teachers to embed research-informed practices. And Mariam Atala. Mariam is Primary Head of Teaching and Learning at Australian International Academy in Sydney. Welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have you here to talk about phonics in the primary classroom. We're getting some lovely responses there. I'll start off with our first question. How important is a consistent approach to the teaching of phonics? And Grace, I might go to you first.
Thank you. Well, there is quite a lot of research that shows that it's important to teach phonics consistently, more so sort of explicitly and systematically. So that having a system is, it's a precursor to being consistent. So we've known this for a long time, for many years, and in the major literacy reports in the 2000s, like the National Inquiry for the teaching of literacy in Australia, the National Reading Panel in the United States, and the Rose Report in the UK, they all said that it's important to teach phonics systematically and explicitly. This makes sure that nothing is missed out. There's less room for confusion, and children are not going to be left behind if they change schools or change classes, and there is consistency across the school because there is a system in the school. So by explicit, most of you will know that just means overtly explaining concepts such as correspondences between graphemes and phonemes, and it will include usually some demonstration and interaction between the teacher and the children. And being systematic, as I just said, means having some kind of system for teaching phonics. There are lots of different programs for teaching phonics and they all recommend various systems. But if you look at them, there is a lot of overlap, a lot of commonality between the various programs, like the letters and sounds starts with SATPIN, SATPIN, teaching those letters first with their corresponding sounds. And you'll see similar systems in various programs around. So although it's really important to be systematic and explicit, I think it's also not important not to forget about those opportunities to teach incidentally and responsively when the opportunity arises. So if a child expresses an interest or is ready to learn how to read a particular word or wants to learn how to write a particular word, then it would be, not ideal to say, no, that's not in our system just yet. We won't do that. So consistency is important. Schools do have consistent whole school literacy plans in general. So I think it is really happening in schools already. There is a perception amongst some people, though, that it might not be happening. We sometimes hear media discourse that universities aren't teaching phonics properly and that schools are therefore not teaching it. But if you look at what's happening in schools, there is a lot of really high quality teaching going on. So I think that's my 2 minutes there. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Grace. Thank you. And I think you're right. We've got a lot of people coming today to listen about phonics, and I think that just shows how engaged people are in this, and that schools are really working on their plans and looking, as you've said, about that consistency across school, teachers working together and working to these consistent teaching practices. And as you've said, down to the consistency of sequence. Janet, it would be really great to get your perspective on consistency, and particularly around, certain components where you will be of the phonics teaching that you want to make sure are consistent.
Yeah, look, I'd probably reiterate a lot of what Grace said, but certainly scope and sequence, and that is important that you've got your junior team working together and making sure they cover things. I think it's interesting just to look at consistency from the point of view about how young children learn, and that when there's almost a routine or a consistent way of doing things, it allows them to really focus in. So they're not having to think about what am I meant to be doing here and how I'm meant to be engaging, but it just means they kind of know what's happening, what's coming up, what the purpose of this is, and they can go straight to engaging in learning. And probably I'd just add consistency in terms of the rigour, that it is something that we do daily and that we don't necessarily do for big stretches of time, but we do it for short daily amounts that have a good rigour and good movement about them. Probably the only other thing about consistent would be the assessment, that we're consistently assessing the children just to monitoring their development, that they are learning, and what we might need to go back and revise or how we might need to diversify for some children. Probably they're the main elements that I would add.
That's really great. So I think, from that, I think we can see that there's this kind of top level of consistency around planning and, the school having a consistent approach, and also coming right down into the specifics of a lesson. And as you say, Janet, delivering things in a structured way, because that sort of takes away distraction for students. They know what's coming and they can really focus on that content. So really interesting the way we can think about consistency with teaching phonics at these various levels of teaching. Let's talk now a little bit about the structure of phonics sessions. So we've just been talking about having these times, these regular times that we're focusing on phonics. Nathaniel, could I ask you, what would you say are the key elements of a good phonics teaching session?
So it's a real pleasure to talk about this topic. I think teachers like myself love to get into the nitty-gritty of how much time should you spend on this and how much time should you spend on that. I think some schools are doing some great work, being really innovative about how they allocate time and resources so that not a minute is wasted of their child's time. So I think it's obviously starting off with phonemic awareness is a really key component. I think short, sharp practice, and as Janet said, very much daily rigorous practice in phonemic awareness is really key. This is both phonemic awareness at the sound level without necessarily using letters, so using tokens or using other objects and things to talk about the sounds within words, but then also phonemic awareness practice with letters as well. So really phonemic awareness starts off as a bit of a warm-up, if you like, in many literacy blocks, but then also can continue in the way that you continually hear sounds in words and put sounds back together to make words in when you're reading and spelling in your phonics lesson. I'd also recommend a brief code review or a phoneme grapheme correspondence review. So just a short, sharp 5 or sometimes even 4 minute sort of time of your lesson where you're actually just looking at the grapheme phoneme correspondences that you've looked at, sometimes called codes because it's nice and easy to say, and so that students have lots of practice just by giving them an opportunity to recognize and remember the sounds that those letters make, or those digraphs, for instance. This, as you said, Grace, really does align with the scope and sequence. So it starts with a small number of phonemes and a small number of correspondences to begin with, but then this can grow over time. So that review might include a very short number of sounds to begin with, but then will get added to over time. And we want to revisit older ones that we haven't looked at for a long time and sort of have that based on a forgetting curve, so that we know that the kids aren't going to forget all those great patterns that we've spent time on earlier. Then the bulk of your phonics block, just to sort of round things out, is really introducing the new code knowledge or new phoneme grapheme correspondences, or a particular spelling pattern or spelling rule, such as how the E sort of works on the end of words and the job it might have for changing the vowel in words that have a magic E or a bossy E, for instance, or how we do suffix sort of rules such as the Y changing to I and things like that. So there's a new concept that's introduced, and then lots and lots and lots of practice reading and spelling words with that pattern in it. So it's really critical to get kids actually getting lots of exposures in that time that they have with you in the moment. And then after they've had lots of practice and lots of opportunity for error correction and feedback, and making it really fun and energetic and exciting as well, giving them basically an opportunity to practice that at the text level is really important as well. And this is where the decodable readers might be really relevant in the foundation or the prep or pre-primary, depending on your state, or kinder, the first year of school, and then the grade 1, especially for those students who still need it, about 10 minutes of paired fluency together where they're actually reading 1 page at a time, 1 minute at a time, and then swapping, and they're having a chance at listening and then also reading themselves. A really great part of the literacy block to practice those phonics skills in the context of really interesting and fantastic books as well. So in a nutshell, if I've said it adequately, I think those are the main components.
That's fantastic, and I think it's great to hear those key areas that this session might be broken down into. And one of the things I really loved in what you said then, Nathaniel, was making sure that there is that energy and engagement and enthusiasm happening, because I think that's really key here. And Hayley, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on this question about good elements, and maybe particularly about this engagement and energy as well, because I know that's something that we've sort of talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joanna. And of course, I echo everything Nathaniel has said about this. I think, being really clear with the children in the objective of the lesson, today we're learning to read and write the sound OOL. There's a really clear intention there, and they know and understand what they're learning. As Nathaniel, pointed out in detail, that revision of previous learning in terms of those grapheme phoneme correspondences, or GPCs, if I can just use that easier to, say term. As well as introducing, that new GPC as well. And building speed of reading those sounds, because that's really important for children when it comes to blending those sounds. If they're reading the word or looking at the word mat and they can see instantly it's act, and there's no hesitation, then that blending, is going to happen more readily than if they're hesitating on those sounds. So, that's a key component of I would say, that daily lesson, is that practice of building that speed and fluency of reading those sounds. And then again, as Nathaniel pointed out, the application of that learning, practicing reading decodable phrases or sentences, books, texts that match the GPCs that those children have learnt. as well as common exception words that we're teaching them as well, in order to be able to read a story, because we need to introduce those, for that as well, and again in a cumulative way. So we don't need to throw all the common exception words at them at once, but certainly gradually introduce them as they're needed. So plenty of opportunity to apply and practice. And then if I could just talk a little bit about the written component of a good phonics lesson as well. And this is something that I certainly learned early on, working with Ruth Miskin, is the importance of children learning to form the letters early, as they're learning to read them. And that just because a child can read a sound, it doesn't mean they can automatically write that sound down, although, that letter or those letters to represent that sound, that this needs to be really explicitly taught as well and practiced, and that getting it right from the beginning is crucial. And then that practice of segmenting spoken words into their sounds to then be able to write those corresponding, letter or letters, which they can do because we've taught them how to form those letters. Dictation is a really key element of a good phonics lesson, providing children with the opportunity to practice words in sentences, again, with only those GPCs and exception words that they've learned, that we've taught them. This allows them to practice and apply their spelling without having to think of what to write. That's really important. So they can just focus on those elements of transcription. And absolutely 100% participation in every lesson. And this sort of talks to your question around engagement, Joanna. That's crucial. And I've learned a lot around that, lots of choral response, lots of partner work. Hands up has no place in a phonics lesson, because this really cuts down on opportunities for talk and for learning. And we need to check understanding of all children in a lesson. So obviously hands up will reduce that opportunity.
And if I can be cheeky there, Joanna, I was going to just add to that, because Hayley's made me realise that I didn't. Thank you for talking about irregular or common exception words. I didn't mention that in my little overview. And I also didn't talk about the importance of mini whiteboards. I think these are a brilliant invention, a very low-tech solution to get inside what's happening in students' heads as they're learning to read and decode new words, and also how they're learning to apply spelling patterns. So I completely agree with you, Hayley, that we need to be constantly monitoring and giving lots of opportunities to respond. The whiteboards are also an engagement tool as well, because when they can show what they're learning and show what they're thinking, working with partners, but then also reporting back chorally and with their whiteboards are really important. And I just got these out because code review or phoneme grapheme correspondence review can be as quick as some little flashcards that you just have where you go over the common sounds. And some of them might have one sound, or some of them might have two sounds. But it's as quick as like a 3-minute review of those things, just so you're priming them to then start using that knowledge when they're then reading the words that correspond. And I love that Hayley said that we're looking for giving them text that is at their the knowledge that they've already built and allows them to consolidate what they're doing. So sorry for jumping in there.
No, of course, anytime. I agree wholeheartedly. And, the flashcards that you held up there, I've got some behind me. They're such a useful tool. And if I can just add in there as well, not just in that phonics lesson that, you're teaching at that time of the day, but to have them, to hand all throughout the day and be constantly reviewing, before we go out to lunch, or, see a cue, review, we go down the line, and, just finding many, many opportunities throughout the day for that retrieval practice and that practice of reading those sounds at speed. So just to sort of round off, I guess I would say, it's really important that your lesson is carefully planned and thought out, that the teacher is engaging, that there's the pace of the lesson, I think, is important. We want to make the most of the time that we have for teaching. Routines really help with this. Systems, I don't want to spend my time managing. I want to spend my time teaching the sounds. Not too much extra stuff. I would add as well, and if I can quote Anita Archer's famous line, cut the stuff and cut the fluff and teach the stuff. I know that was a big learning curve for me as an early career teacher. I didn't realize how much I use language unnecessarily in lessons. I would find myself narrating what I was doing sometimes. Now we're going to read the sounds, and then I'm going to do this, and it was just a lot of narration and a lot for children to process when they're already processing a lot of new learning in that session. So for me as a teacher, I've certainly learned how to strip back that unnecessary instructional language. Lots of showing rather than telling, lots of modelling, and I can tell you it's certainly far more effective.
Thanks, Hayley. And I think there's some things here that are tying back to our topic of consistency as well, just in terms of having that consistent plan for these phonics sessions that is really to the point. And I think that does really keep the pace going. Kids know what to expect. And it does kind of get that energy going, which we sort of talked about as well, so that the kids are staying really engaged and focusing on all these things that we've been talking about, doing these reviews of the previously taught GPCs, making sure we're then introducing the new ones, and also those irregular words which we talked about. And that goes back again to what we talked about in consistency and scope and sequence. Before we move on to the next question, I might just ask Mariam about what's been your classroom experience in terms of running a phonics teaching session.
Well, I'm just going to bounce off Hayley and Dr. Nathaniel. Of course, Hayley has been our mentor through every step of the way, through the Ruth Viskin Read Writing program. We've started this program this year, and one of the highlights of this program was how engaging it actually was. And of course, you guys have broken down the importance of, the scope and the structure of the lesson, the importance of engagement, repetition, rigorous assessment. If I can take anything a little bit further in terms of consistency, maybe coming from the teacher approach, is the consistency maybe amongst the teaching across the whole school when you are trying to, boost standards, or, at least we are trying to boost standards, enhance literacy practices. So we need to make sure that there is a consistent approach across the program as a whole. And so on a daily basis, we do make sure that our reading leader, even if it's not on a daily basis, a few times a week, of course, we're doing the program, an hour a day, 4 times a week. But, there's always opportunities for development, for growth, for training, and for coaching. So, these teachers are being supported in the classroom, and then, observed what are the areas of strength, what are areas of improvement, what do we still need to work on. So when we take back all of that feedback and give it to the teachers, allow teachers more time to practice and more time for training, whether it's online or with Hayley, it just goes back, that consistency goes back into the classroom and ensures that children are getting the best. And, we are a PYP school as well. So we do a lot of integration, which is, I think, another really important element of phonics, is opportunities for integration in other writing activities or spelling activities. So when you have that consistency in the classroom, especially with practice, and that everyone, even the attention grabbers, on how to rotate them around the classroom, how to do partner work. So whichever teacher walks in can take that on and continue with the strategies. So when we do fret talk, for example, or, review the sounds, or, can you segment, that consistent approach throughout the whole school, just make sure that enhancement is manifested all throughout. So everything that, Hayley and Dr. Nathaniel said is, top. If I could just add on that one little thing from a teacher's perspective, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Mariam. That's really great. And I love that you're talking about how, teachers are working together in a school and supporting each other, because that's really important as well, because, in whatever we're doing, it's great to get feedback, and there's things that we can work on, and, to work with colleagues to think about how you could do things in different ways, or, those areas where you'd like to improve. Janet, are there any extra things you'd like to add in terms of things that you think can be really impactful in phonics teaching sessions?
Just to, and it's been addressed in a way, but again, just to remember the way young children learn. And I think sometimes, particularly in the last few years, with this urgency to ensure that phonics is well learnt, well taught and well learnt, we're forgetting that children have sort of an approach to learning, which generally is, sure, there is some element of imitation, so they need to hear and see and they will copy, but children learn by engaging, by doing, by using their bodies and different senses in a way. So it goes back to looking at resources as well. So, you know, when we can use body movement, where we can use the whiteboards, the counters, the getting up and moving to step out words, the magnetic letters, and also just remembering that their writing is developing, their handwriting skills. And so not to be putting too much on them in terms of once we start using our phonics to write, there's just so much going on for them that it can just be a bit of an overload. So just being really mindful of where they're at in their development and the way that young children learn as well and what suits them.
That's fantastic.
And just to pick up on that, Janet, just to show two different examples. In my previous school before I joined La Trobe Uni, we had, last year, we did a really new approach to sort of teaching phonics, and we're really rigorous about how we were doing it. But we didn't have a set of magnetic letters for each student. So in the early stages, when they were still learning their handwriting, many were held back in that spelling section of the phonics session because they didn't have the ability to form the letters. This year, since I've left, which I'm very jealous about, they all had a set of magnetic letters for every child to begin with. And as each code was introduced, they then started using it. And it has had a real boost in their reading, but also their spelling, and then has facilitated that link to handwriting. So I think completely agree with you that those tools are very important for making that bridge.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, and I think, Janet, the things that you picked up on, things like body movement, and, you know, that's one of the things about the very basic early parts of handwriting as well, is really using that body movement and making some of those connections. And so I think it's fantastic that you've raised thinking about these other areas of research that we know about how children learn, and some of the other things that we're teaching that we know are really great developmentally, and making sure that we're bringing all of those things together in our teaching and having those approaches combined as much as we can. Grace, I'd like to talk a little bit about comprehension. In your experience, how do you think comprehension can be incorporated with phonics? Again, thinking about these important areas that are required for reading, about bringing comprehension alongside phonics in the teaching of reading.
Yes, thank you for that question, Joanna. So I think that children learn comprehension long before they can actually read themselves. They can start learning comprehension, even if they haven't got any decoding skills or not much, just by being read aloud to, modelled reading, shared reading, and having discussions about the meaning of the text. So that can go alongside a phonics programme. It can be integrated as well, because even though shared reading is not as popular as it was, it's still a fantastic context to point out some of those letter sound correspondences and words in the context of an authentic text. So I think it's really important to remember to use authentic text, children's literature, things that have got that children can make connections to. So if we think about those text to self connections, text to world connections, so that can all be running alongside a phonics program. Some of the decodable texts have very, very simple and short sentences with quite restricted vocabulary, and that's fine for decoding and practicing decoding. It can be very empowering for children as well to work with those texts that are at their level of decoding. But at the same time, it's not going to be teaching children a more elaborated vocabulary different sentence structures and things like that are very important to comprehension. And so it would be an awful shame if children were denied the opportunity to learn about comprehension of these more authentic texts until after they've got to a certain stage in their decoding. And in fact, you know, the Australian curriculum has the literacy and the literature strands, which, you know, they've got children need to be responding to texts and creating texts and all kinds of things, which shouldn't be just decoding decodables and dictation, because they're for phonics, but there's another level of reading which is more to do with comprehension. So they would be my points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about you make a really great point there, that, you know, comprehension begins, you know, as soon as students are, you know, starting to understand things around them and hearing other kinds of texts, particularly read to them at the early stages. And there's so many wonderful books out there for children to engage with. So certainly thinking about how we are still including all these types of activities in the classroom alongside phonics. Nathaniel, it'd be great to hear from you on comprehension as well.
Thank you. Sorry about that noise. I didn't realize I was unmuted. Just trying to find a phone charger so I don't lose contact. I really love to echo the comments that were made just then by Grace. It was lovely to hear that discussion of integration and also teaching two different sort of priorities side by side. I think we can get lost in the weeds sometimes thinking that, oh, I must focus on phonics and then comprehension is going to come later. But at the end of the day, as part of a whole integrated approach in your, whether it's a foundation, first year of school or a grade 1 classroom, there is going to be elements that will support the decoding aspect of reading and writing, as well as the comprehension side and written expression side as well. So having those texts are really important, and having really fantastic opportunities for students to hear and to learn from stories and to learn from storytelling opportunities are just so important. So knowing that you don't have to shy away from rich text just because you're reading decodables, I think is really key. And also knowing that you can you can also focus on phonics sometimes when you're really trying to teach something new. So not everything, as we were talking about before, has to be as part of a big story that you're unpacking. You can do those little activities that help to build confidence and skill. You want to move students pretty quickly to having an opportunity to see that in action. And so, like Janet was saying, pointing out this is an example of a digraph that we've learned while you're reading a rich text is so lovely, because that's showing the connection between all the work that you're doing in phonics and all the work that you're wanting to then do in the comprehension space. And same if you're reading a funny sentence or you're doing a dictation, talk about if it's relevant and it doesn't distract them, talk about the funny rhyming word or the funny thing that you've put together in whatever the resource might be. Because at the end of the day, yes, they're learning how to spell and read and maybe handwrite and decode, but you also, there's meaning that's being unlocked through the very process of playing around with codes and understanding words. So it's very playful, it's very enjoyable, and also at the end of the day, this is going to be an integrated system that they're all drawing upon and using. And sometimes it's, those connections are more obvious than people realize. Absolutely.
Thanks, Nathaniel. That was great. I'd like to talk a little bit about phonic practice now. And as we were talking about earlier, phonic practice, applying your knowledge of GPCs and your blending is really important, and especially as we're trying to move students towards that automaticity that then helps with fluency down the track. So Mariam, it'd be really good to hear from you about how your school is using fully decodable text in that phonic practice space.
Sure. So we have a focus every week, depending on the challenge group there would be a focus on the sound that's being presented. Whatever sound is being focused on that week, there will always be a decodable text to accompany it. And the purpose of having the decodable text there is to, boost that reading proficiency that you might not see at the beginning of the week, but then you see excel as you get through the end of the week. So I'll come back and I'll talk about just what that looks like in the classroom. After that, we also have some extra home readers that are taken home. It'll be a different title, but it will still be a decodable text that aligns with the phonic lesson that they're focusing on, the sound of the week. Again, repetition, putting knowledge into practice, and then being able to boost their confidence as well. So you might not be able to read this independently at the beginning, but with that practice, with that repetition that happens in the classroom, they've got their independent time. They've also got partner time. We also expose the children with partners to their decodable text of the week. As soon as they sit down and read, you can see them starting to, segment the words and sounds and apply, the Fred talk and all the strategies that are taught. But it's not until we actually allow them to have the first read, we call the first read. And then once we take the book and the teacher reads it, that is when you start to see an amazing change in the way that they are actually reading and recognizing and comprehending the book. So that reading practice is happening throughout the week, and that's what happens. So we see, and they are assessed at the end of the week, and we see the improvements. Rigorous assessment is also very important. Having time to also sit with students, listen to how they're reading, their fluency as they go. And live feedback, so to correct their reading as they're going. And we learned the importance of live feedback, so we don't encourage incorrect behaviors as they go. If you don't give live feedback, as soon as they make a mistake or say the incorrect sound, or we say, okay, great job, okay, you're so close, that was really, really close. It could be that they are phonetically correct, that the C was a k at the time, but it wasn't in that particular word, it was a s. So we say, oh, that's great, you're right, you did apply the correct phonetic sound. That live feedback is quite important as well. So decodable text are used throughout the week. We've got options there for them as well. And we make sure that repetition happens on a weekly basis. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And Hayley, it'd be great to sort of hear your perspective as well in terms of, your experience in the classroom and now training.
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to reiterate that a decodable text is a necessary, tool. It's like the training wheels of readers, and that, ultimately we want children not to have to use those, and we don't want to keep controlling the text that they're reading. It's there for that practice of what we've taught them. So what we know is secure, and they're consolidating and practicing and reading that, controlled text. It's so important, as Grace pointed out, to be reading to children for comprehension alongside this. As Grace said, those decodable texts contain quite simple vocabulary because of the need for it to be easily decoded at the stage they're at. So those texts contain, the children can say a lot more words than they can read, and we need to expose them to so much more so that they are able to comprehend those words when they can read them. That's really important, and to help them fall in love with reading and want to read all those beautiful, rich, authentic texts for themselves when they can. So it's necessary, and they help children feel successful, and success is motivating. And so if I can just share a little analogy, which is, learning to play that delightful instrument that is the recorder, which I'm sure we all remember learning to play. And typically children are taught just a few simple notes, such as G, A, and B, to begin with, and then they can play a simple tune, can't they, such as Hot Cross Buns, and they practice this simple tune over and over and over again. And it's always surprising, actually, how much joy children get from playing just these three notes. And then after being taught just a few more notes, they could play a slightly more complex tune, like Amazing Grace, for example, and practice this tune over and over again. The key here is that beginner recorder players are only ever given music with the notes they can play. Once children can place their fingers on the holes accurately, they can practice to gain that fluency over and over again. Their fingers can move more quickly. They can pay attention to playing expressively, even when playing a really simple tune like Hot Cross Buns. So I guess what I'm saying is that learning to read music is a bit like learning to read using phonics. It's only once we can read the words that we're able to focus on that fluency and expression. And therefore, children should read at that independent level storybooks that contain the sounds we know they can read, that have been carefully matched. And they know that just with maybe a little bit of help, like Mariam pointed out, that they will be able to read every word in every story that we give them. And that by the time they say take it home to read, that they can read this confidently and like a storyteller and celebrate that. They know that we're never going to ask them to guess a word, either from a picture in the context in the same way, or the context rather, in the same way that we wouldn't ask them to guess musical notes that we hadn't taught them. So I think decodable readers are really important for setting children up for success, because again, success is motivating.
That's fantastic, Hayley. And again, that sort of thread coming through around engagement and motivation for students. And also understanding all the things that we're talking about, they're all components of a bigger set of teaching, and there are multiple parts to reading. And we're thinking about how these components all work together to get the outcomes that we're looking for. Nathaniel, would you like to add anything else around your sort of use of decodable text in the classroom, or your experience of different books of that type?
I just want to echo with Hayley's sentiments there. Just how fantastic that metaphor is. I love the analogy of simple songs on a recorder as a really clear example of introducing musicality and satisfaction with getting through a whole piece. It's very similar to the satisfaction that children experience when they first read their first decodable book and when they progress onto more complex ones. I think the most exciting thing about decodables is that the process through which children learn to apply their growing decoding skills and eventually fluent word recognition skills, because we know that if students practice their phonics skills and practice them in the context of reading books eventually, and passages to begin with, or maybe sentences before that eventually they do start recognizing words by sight. And that's what fluent reading looks like, is that ultimate automatic recognition. But we get there through practice and through analyzing words and putting them back together. So the satisfaction they get is that, reading becomes easier. They can read further. They can read more exception words because they get this amazing thing called set for variability, which the reading scientists are trying to understand right now, why it is children can read a word like s, and then some children just figure out that must be was, without actually having been taught that pattern, because there's an approach within our brains that help us to actually make sense of those exceptions. And through that practice with decodables, the best thing about decodables is that you eventually get off them and you don't need them anymore. And you suddenly realize there's a whole world of books that's opened up because of all that practice that you've done. So I've had some of my foundation students really surprise me how quickly they've progressed and how quickly they've moved from level to level. So never think that you have to keep your students at a certain spot on how complex the decodables are. Always do the progress monitoring to see what they're up to. They might be ready to go much further than you thought because of the work they're doing in class, because of the spelling practice, because of what they're doing at home, because of the oral language that they're developing. All of these things come together to make fluent reading easier and therefore make comprehension easier. So the most satisfying thing about decodables is that eventually students leave them. Some take longer than others and need more support, but eventually they do leave them and they're left with fantastic, incredible decoding skills and problem-solving skills ready to use to comprehend and attack really complicated text as they progress in their school years.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Nathaniel. We're coming up to our last question. I'm going to go around the panel for this one. While we're talking, our little poll's going to pop up. So when that does, please check your answer and let us know. And it'll be great to sort of see what people think about that one. So what I'm going to go around and ask now is just what is everyone's top tip or top tips for a really successful phonics teaching session? And I might start with you, Grace.
So I would just say do the things that we've all been talking about today, but definitely have a bit of explicit teaching, some chance to practice, and some application, and make it fun and engaging.
Love that. Thank you, Grace. That's great. Fantastic. Mariam?
I would definitely bounce off Grace and say the repetition is very important. The engagement is very important. And to also explicitly express the focus, the objective of what they are learning. And that every day you are reviewing the sounds, okay, of what they've known before and what they're going to learn. I would say, yeah, just the repetition, consistency and repetition. Yeah.
Fantastic. Janet?
Probably I'd reiterate a lot of what's been said, but just maybe to add to it, the ensuring that the sessions are short and sharp, not too long sitting, and that they are the children are very well engaged in it. And if I might just add that we can, and it sort of extends beyond phonics, just remember that the purpose for what we're teaching and the purpose for what the children are learning, reading and writing, is all about communication. So just making sure we always link it back to that.
I love that. Thanks, Janet. Hayley?
I think, have that clear purpose. Again, full participation, really important. Pace, positive teaching, passion, love teaching, reading. Because if you love it, the children will too. And it's human nature to love doing the things that we're good at. And if we want all of our children to love reading and become fluent, comprehending readers, then we really do need to love teaching reading, even those associations between letters and sounds. And as we know, reading, once it's set in motion, it feeds on itself and grows. And the more that children read, the more they know. And the more they know, the more they read. So really love it, enjoy it. It's wonderful. It's like having a superpower when you know how to teach children to read.
It really is. And Nathaniel?
And just to reiterate what we've been talking about today, I think the consistency is such a blessing for students, but also for teachers, having really good routines, having great structures in place so that students know what's expected of them and they can add progressively to their learning. Having a solid scope and sequence and a really strong structure that supports your planning, it's very hard to stay on top of the daily production of resources. So having a good set of resources ready, potentially a program, maybe a set of curriculum documents you've put together with your colleagues, but having consistency between classes, as Mariam was saying before, just helps so much with sharing the load of what we're trying to do. And then if you're having that consistency there, you can actually focus more on what your students are doing. So then you're not thinking about what am I doing next, you're thinking about what are my students doing and what are they telling me through the little errors or little changes in sounds or in letters that you're seeing. And you're looking out for, can everyone hear that internal consonant in a word like split? Are they dropping off the P? Are they dropping off the L? Can they hear the difference between the long E and the short I? And, seeing all of those errors that then become the fruit of what you want to do next with your responsive teaching. So scope and sequence allows you to become, and great resources allows you to become a problem solver as a teacher as well. So you can constantly adapt and be responsive to the needs in front of you.
Thanks, everyone. That was so great. It's really great to hear everyone's perspective. And hopefully for our attendees today, there's been some positive ideas there that you might want to take away and have a think about. I'll just let everyone know the results of our poll. So our question was, how often are you including a review of known or taught GPCs in your phonics teaching session? This was something we touched on with our panelists, and it was great to hear their perspective on this. And the results are 60% of people were saying every lesson, 23% weekly, and 17% every few weeks. So great to hear the results of that poll, and maybe listening to our panelists today, there might have been some information there that has made you think a little about that and think about how you might like to incorporate that review, really consistently across your phonics teaching sessions.
And if I can jump in and say the reason where there might be some differences there, I think potentially the question could be interpreted in two different ways. You don't have to go over every single code that you've ever taught them in every lesson. So choosing a sample of older ones, newer ones, medium sort of length ones, just means you can keep that to a brief amount of time. But certainly that, I think the themes of today, I agree, Joanna, is that daily practice, as everyone has agreed, is really, really important to consolidate and also gets everyone ready for learning.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. So thank you, Grace, Janet, Nathaniel, Mariam, and Hayley. It's just been wonderful to have you here today, and I really appreciate your input into the session. So thank you.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And I'd just like to let all our attendees know that we do have 2 further webinar sessions coming up. If you're interested to join those. So I'll be hosting a webinar on Tuesday, the 8th of August, introducing Oxford University Press's brand new fully decodable series, Oxford Reading for Comprehension Discover. So that's another free session if you'd like to sign up for that. And then Wednesday, the 23rd of August, our panellist Hayley Goldsworthy will be talking about the Read Writing program. And you can go to oup.com.au if you'd like to sign up, or we've got a QR code on screen. So I'd like to wish everyone a really good evening, and thank you to our panellists again, and for all of you for attending. It's been wonderful to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.